The house was silent in the way of houses that have been too long without a master. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of held breath. Rooms preserved rather than lived in. Holland covers on the chairs in the formal drawing room. The hall clock wound on schedule, but by a woman who had no one to tell the time to. Cecily Vane, Viscountess Ashvere, had lived inside that silence for 18 months, and she had made her own small sounds to fill it. The scratch of her pen at the writing desk, the measured footsteps of her morning constitutional along the east corridor. And at evenings, when the dark came too early, and the fire in the library needed no companion to justify it, the low, clear voice of her reading aloud to Mrs. Potts, who sat with her hands in her lap and pretended to need the company as much as her mistress did. It was into one of those evenings that Edmund Vane, Viscount Ashvere, walked. He had come on foot from the village, which was not how viscounts arrived at their own estates, but Edmund had not trusted himself to send word ahead. 18 months missing in the peninsula, the fever that took him at Badajoz, the long convalescing at a farmhouse in Extremadura with a Portuguese family who spoke no English and asked no questions about the hollow-eyed Englishman in the back room, and then the slow journey home through Lisbon and Portsmouth and 3 weeks of coastal road, which he had not hurried, because he had not known what awaited him. He had known only what he had left. A 4-week marriage to a woman he had not loved, a house his mother controlled in his name, and a rumor of cowardice that Colonel Whitmore had planted with the efficiency of a man who understood how quickly a county could water a seed of suspicion into full growth. He paused inside the front door, which Mrs. Potts had left unlatched for the cat, and he heard her voice. He did not recognize it at first as his wife's, because the woman he had left had been quiet, contained and watchful and young, 18 years old to his 32, brought to him by arrangement and accepted without sentiment on either side. The voice coming from the library was not young in that way. It was measured, and it was certain, and it was reading aloud from something she had written herself. Lord Ashvere served with the 23rd Foot at Badajoz. He entered the breach when ordered. He held his position when the breach failed, and the colonel commanding the wing mistook a withdrawal for a rout. The testimony of 3 surviving officers of his company, obtained by correspondence at the cost of 9 months' patience, establishes beyond doubt that the account attributed to Colonel Whitmore is a fabrication, and that the Viscount bore himself in that action as this county and this family have every reason to be proud of. If Lord Ashvere does not return to say so himself, I intend to say so for him. The pause that followed was Mrs. Potts saying, in a careful voice, that the county assembly was not a court of law. No, his wife said. It is worse. It hears no appeal. Edmund stood in the corridor with his campaign coat still on his back and his hat in his hand, and did not go in. Not yet. He stood and listened to the silence that followed, and in it he heard the full weight of what this woman had done in his name for a man who had not earned it, had not asked for it, and had not, until this moment, been worth it. The campaign had begun in the 2nd month, when the county's opinion had solidified into something that would require more than time to undo. Cecily had understood this with the clarity of a woman who had grown up watching her father navigate the machinery of rural consequence, the measure of who owed what to whom, which names carried weight, which silences were consenting, and which were merely polite. Colonel Whitmore's account had not arrived in the county as gossip. It had arrived as the measured testimony of a senior officer to a family whose social position guaranteed it a hearing, and it had been received with the credulous sympathy that people extend to bad news about those they were never entirely sure of. Edmund had left within weeks of the marriage. He had written rarely. The county had already half decided he was the sort of man who did not quite suit before Whitmore's letter gave them a more specific category to put him in. Cecily had written to the regiment in the 3rd month, She had written to the War Office in the 4th. She had written to the families of the surviving officers of the 23rd Foot, whose names she had obtained from the regimental records through a correspondence so patient and so persistent that the regimental secretary had eventually written back with a note that said, in the language of a man surprised by a woman who refused to be ignored. Miss Hartwell, to which Cecily had written back quietly, without accusation, correcting the name, had earned his cooperation. Lieutenant Garrard had replied in 6 weeks. Captain Henley in 10. Ensign Doyle's letter had taken 4 months to find her, posted to the wrong county seat first, arriving finally in July with a water stain at the corner and the handwriting of a young man who had not written many letters and understood the weight of this one. She had read each letter twice, and then a 3rd time, checking the accounts against each other, because she was not going to present an inconsistency as evidence. When the 3 accounts aligned, she had begun to draft. She had not told Alditha what she was doing. She had attended every assembly of the season, every dinner invitation that the county extended out of the particular social obligation that attaches to young widows, and she had spoken in the careful, measured way of a woman who understands that she is working against a current and does not want to alarm it. She had named the officers. She had named the accounts. She had declined to call Whitmore a liar in any language more direct than inconsistent. She had done this for 14 months, and it had cost her the easy social warmth of a county that found her stubbornness peculiar, and the goodwill of a mother-in-law who had twice attempted to suggest, in the polished language of social persuasion, that the most dignified course was retirement from further public appearances. Cecily had thanked her and continued. He was still standing there when the library door opened, and Mrs. Potts walked out carrying the empty tea tray, and stopped so abruptly that the cups rattled in their saucers, and said very quietly, with the expression of a woman confronting a ghost, "My lord." Cecily appeared in the doorway behind her. She was in gray, which was not mourning, but was close enough to it that the county had been willing to allow the ambiguity. Her hair was up in the plain way she favored. No ornament, no concession to the assembly she had planned to attend in 1 hour's time. She was 22, and she had the face of a woman who had made a great many decisions alone, and the stillness of a woman who did not permit herself the luxury of visible shock. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "My lord," she said at last, "you are alive." "I am," he said. "I am glad of it." Her voice did not waver. "You will want something to eat. Mrs. Potts will see to it." He had expected relief. He had expected some version of the weeping he had braced himself against on the 3-week road from Portsmouth. He had not expected to be offered supper in the tone of a competent housekeeper by a wife who had been defending his honor to county assemblies in his absence, and who now looked at him as though the most important question was whether the cold mutton was still edible. It disarmed him entirely. If you have ever watched a woman greet the man who did not deserve her, stay close. This is that story. He came to the table in the kitchen because the formal dining room seemed absurd, and he ate cold mutton and bread and a very decent wedge of hard cheese, while Mrs. Potts made herself invisible with the efficiency of a woman who understood that the next conversation was not hers to overhear. Cecily sat across the kitchen table with her hands folded and did not eat. She watched him with the careful attention of a woman who had spent 18 months studying a man through his absence and was now recalibrating against the fact of his presence. She was not what he had carried in his memory of her. He had carried the girl from the wedding breakfast, pale and composed and thoroughly illegible, the daughter of a Wiltshire gentleman who had needed the settlement too badly to ask whether his daughter wanted it. He had told himself that she was too young, too quiet, too lacking in the particular warmth that had made Louisa so necessary to him. He had believed it. He had left for the peninsula within 3 weeks of the ceremony, and had not written more than duty required. And he had understood this as propriety rather than cowardice, which was the first and least important of the lies he had told himself that year. "You were reading something," he said when the bread was gone. "I came in through the front. I heard part of it." A very small hesitation crossed her face. "How much did you hear?" "The testimony of the 3 surviving officers of your company," he said, "and your intention to say so for me, if I did not return to say it myself." "I see." She looked at her folded hands. "I should have asked. You will think it overreaching." "I think?" he said, and then stopped, because what he thought was not yet available to him in language. He thought that 9 months' patience meant she had written those letters when he was still presumed dead. He thought that a woman who had been contracted into a marriage and left within weeks of it did not, as a rule, spend the next 18 months gathering military testimony on her absent husband's behalf. He thought that he had no framework for what was sitting across his kitchen table. "You should not go to the assembly tonight," he said. "I gave my word. I am returned. The speech is unnecessary." "The speech," she said, with a restraint that he suspected had cost her more than the words implied, "is not about necessity. The county has held an opinion of you for 1.5 years, an opinion I have been working to correct. If I simply cease to appear now that you have returned, the work is incomplete. What people believe this week is what they will believe in 10 years. He looked at her. She held his gaze without flinching. "Sit down," he said. She was already sitting. She regarded him steadily and said nothing. "I am attempting to issue a command," he said. "I noticed," she said. "You may issue as many as you like. I am going to the assembly." She went. He followed her, at a distance and without announcing himself, because it occurred to him that arriving at the assembly on the arm of the man the county believed dead would produce a different kind of chaos than the evening required. He entered by the side door that opened onto the upper gallery, and he stood in the gallery above the candlelit room and watched his wife walk to the front of it. The Westmoreland County Assembly was held in the long room of the Talbot Inn, which was not a grand venue for a speech, but was where the county gathered in autumn and where, consequently, the county's verdicts were made and unmade. Edmund counted 43 people he recognized from his years on the estate. Several more he did not. And in the far corner, arranged with the precision of a woman who came to assemblies the way other women came to battle, his mother. Lady Alditha sat in the chair that was hers by unspoken law, upright, fan held at the precisely measured half-inch above her knee, Miss Araminta Carver arranged at her right hand like an argument made visible. Miss Carver was 22 and possessed the kind of flawless composure that came from having been told since birth that she was the correct choice. And she wore pale blue and a string of pearls that had been her mother's. And she watched Cecily's approach with an expression that was technically polite and somewhat less than warm. Cecily stood at the front with no lectern and no ceremony. "I am told," she said, "that it is not generally done for a wife to speak to the county on her husband's behalf. I am told this is because a husband is generally present to speak for himself." A brief pause, as dry as Cecily ever permitted herself in public. "I have found myself in unusual circumstances." The room was very quiet. She did not read from the paper she held. She set it on the table beside her and spoke from memory. And what she said was precise and documented, and without a tremor of self-pity. She named the officers. Lieutenant Garrard of the 2nd Company, Captain Henley of the 4th, Ensign Doyle, who had been 17 at Badajoz and was 20 now, and had written to her in a hand so careful it hurt to read it, because he had not written many letters, and understood the weight of this one. She named the breach. She named Colonel Whitmore's account, and the specific point at which it diverged from the accounts of 3 men who had been within 20 feet of Edmund when the breach was held. She did not call Whitmore a liar. She called the accounts inconsistent, and she let the words sit in the room like a stone dropped in still water. In the gallery above, Edmund's hand tightened on the railing. He had stood in the breach. He remembered the smoke so thick it tasted like iron. He remembered the man to his left going down and the question of whether to stop or to press, and the instant's hesitation that Whitmore had called cowardice and that Edmund had called mathematics, the calculation of a man under fire with 6 remaining soldiers and no clear route of retreat. He had made the correct calculation. He had held the position. He had been too ill to defend himself when Whitmore's account began circulating, and then too absent, and then too presumed dead. He had spent 18 months assuming his reputation was simply gone. The way things left behind are simply gone. He had not imagined this. A woman he barely knew, standing in a country inn by candlelight, speaking from memory about Lieutenant Garrard and Ensign Doyle and the geometry of a breach he would not have thought she could name. When she was done, the applause was tentative, because the county was not entirely certain how to respond to a young woman who had delivered what was functionally a legal brief at an autumn assembly. She did not acknowledge the applause. She gathered her paper and walked back to her seat. And the set of her shoulders was the set of a woman who had done what she came to do and did not require the room's affirmation of it. She did not see, because she had not looked up, the way Edmund stood in the gallery with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the top of her plain, dark head with an expression that he would not have been able to name, and that no one present would have believed him capable of. Lady Alditha Vane believed she was capable of a great many things. She had been managing Ashvere Hall and its attached consequences since her husband's death 14 years prior, and she understood the management of reputation with the same thoroughness that she understood the management of an estate in receivership. You identified the liabilities. You contained them. You did not permit sentiment to interfere with the ledger. Edmund's contracted marriage to Miss Hartwell had been a liability she had accepted as necessary. The girl's portion was modest, but the family connection was solid, and Edmund had shown no inclination to marry anyone else since Louisa Fenwick's death. The arrangement had seemed adequate. What she had not accounted for was the girl's disposition. The morning after the assembly, in the private drawing room of her hired house in the village, Alditha set her tea down with the measured precision of a woman choosing her language, and said to Miss Carver, "She makes a spectacle, an embarrassing spectacle, though she has not the self-awareness to recognize it as such. The county tolerates her because she is pathetic. A young wife making a spectacle of herself for a dead man's name." Miss Carver agreed with a small incline of her head. "And now he is not dead," Alditha continued, with the focused displeasure of a woman whose plans have been complicated by inconvenient facts, which presents certain difficulties. The difficulty, specifically, was the paperwork. She had drawn it up 6 months prior, through her own solicitor, citing the grounds of constructive abandonment, specifically Edmund's failure to make any provision for his wife beyond the barest minimum, his absence without substantive correspondence, his reported death without official confirmation. The dissolution had not yet been filed, because Alditha had been waiting for the formal death certificate before proceeding, conscious of how the timing would appear. The paperwork existed nonetheless, and Mr. Graham, a man of unimpeachable dryness and considerable usefulness, was at her disposal. And now Edmund had walked out of Portugal alive, which changed the grounds, but not, Alditha had determined, the intention. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman whose entire architecture of understanding had been built around the premise that the correct people selected the correct matches, and that any deviation from this produced instability, which she had devoted 14 years to preventing. Cecily Hartwell was a pleasant enough young woman of no consequence who had conducted herself with unexpected stubbornness during a period that any sensible bride would have spent in dignified retirement. She was not the correct match. Araminta Carver was the correct match. She had been since Edmund came of age, and the fact that he had entered an inconvenient arrangement did not, in Alditha's view, render the correct match permanently unavailable. She began to prepare. It was Mrs. Potts who noticed the preparations first, in the way that housekeepers notice everything that happens within half a mile of their kitchen, and it was the footman Thomas who passed information to Cecily in the careful roundabout way of a servant trying to be useful, without being implicated. Thomas stood in the back passage of the hall on a cold October morning and recounted what he had heard in brief stumbling phrases, and what he said amounted to this: that Lady Alditha intended to present the dissolution document at the formal military ceremony where Captain Sir Frederick Holeys would deliver the official clearance of Edmund's honor, and that she intended to present it before the clearance, so that the formal recognition of Edmund's name would arrive at a moment when the marriage was already publicly dissolved, and Miss Carver was positioned at his side in the room where everyone who mattered in the county was assembled to witness it. And Thomas said, with the pained fidelity of someone who wishes he had not heard this, "She said, my lady, that you had made a spectacle of yourself for long enough, and that now the spectacle was done." Cecily stood in the east corridor for a long time after Thomas had gone. The words settled into her in the way that words heard 3 times always settle, not with fresh shock, but with the particular weight of something finally confirmed. She had heard the phrase in Alditha's voice in the private aside at the village drawing-room, reported by a mutual acquaintance who had not meant to tell her. She had heard it again at the assembly itself, in the voice of Miss Carver's aunt, who had said it just loudly enough to be overheard, and just softly enough to deny having intended it. Now a 3rd time, from the mouth of a servant relaying the dowager's private words. The county had decided she was a spectacle, and the county was consistent, if nothing else. She smoothed her gown. She considered the corridor's length. She did not go to Edmund with this information, and this was not because she was passive, but because she understood the difference between forcing a choice and allowing one. She had spoken for him because the truth was on his side. She was not going to manufacture a crisis at the last moment to compel a loyalty he had not offered freely. She found him in the library at dawn on the morning before the ceremony, which was not an accident. The fire was low and the light was gray, and she had her feet tucked under her in the old wing chair, and she was holding in both hands a small leather-covered journal with a worn spine and brass corner catches, turning it over in the way she had turned it over many times before. The leather darkened at the edges from handling. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. The journal was his. He had missed it within a week of arriving at the regimental post, had concluded it lost in the journey, and had not sent back for it because the things it contained were not things he had wanted delivered by post to a house he had abandoned. It was the journal of a man who had married a stranger and run from it, and in the pages of the first third, a dead woman's name appeared often enough that a careful reader would understand everything. "You found it," he said. "Within the first week," she said. "It had fallen behind the lining of the writing desk. I did not read it until the 2nd month." She paused. "I read only the one passage, about Miss Fenwick." He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood by the window with his hands behind his back, looking at the gray pre-dawn light over the park. And he was silent for long enough that a woman with less composure would have filled the silence and regretted it. The light came up slowly over the frozen kitchen garden, and outside a rook called once and went quiet. "Louisa died in childbed," he said at last. 2 years before our marriage. The child did not survive either. He kept his eyes on the window. My mother arranged our match while I was still grieving. While the grief was fresh enough that I did not object to a marriage I did not intend to value, I told myself that was propriety. It was not. It was a cowardice of a different order than Whitmore's, and it cost you 18 months in an empty house. That is a debt I do not know how to repay. Cecily was quiet. The fire settled with a soft sound of settling coals. She was very kind, Cecily said at last. From the journal. She sounded very kind. She was, he said. A pause in which the weight of that word was precisely what it was. Then, after a moment, he turned from the window and looked at her directly. You are not unlike her, in that particular. Something crossed her face. Not triumph. Nothing so easy as that. Something quieter, and less expected, and more difficult to hold. He came and sat in the other wing chair. He did not touch her. He looked at the fire. I stood in the gallery, he said. At the assembly, I watched you speak. She waited. I have been in the peninsula, he said. I have been in the breach. I have not seen anything that required more courage than what I watched you do in that room. He paused. You spoke for a man who left you in an empty house and never wrote you anything worth reading, without a word of reproach, without the least evidence of self-pity. I have been asking myself since then, what kind of person does that? One who believes the truth matters, she said, even when it is inconvenient. One who is better than the arrangement she was given, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, Your mother has drawn up a dissolution. He went very still. She told him plainly, in the manner she had rehearsed to herself in the hours since Thomas's revelation, because she had understood that if she was going to say this, she was going to say it without plea and without performance. The document. The solicitor. The timing designed to precede Captain Hollis's ceremony so that the formal recognition of his honor would arrive into a room where the marriage was already dissolved and Araminta Carver was already at hand. When she finished, he said nothing for a full minute. The fire spoke. The light over the park continued its slow arrival. No, he said. Just the one word, quiet and final. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has finished arguing with himself and is now available for other business. That is not how this ends. She looked at him and felt something shift in the architecture of the room, or perhaps in the architecture of herself, in the place that had been braced for this morning to go the other way. His hand moved first, reaching across the arm of the chair, and her hand met it without deliberation, because some responses live below the level of deliberate thought, and she had spent 1.5 years in this house learning the geography of her own convictions, and she knew which way she faced. The formal ceremony was held at Ashvere Hall on the following afternoon. Cecily had prepared the great hall for it 3 days prior, because she had believed in Captain Hollis's clearance, even when she had not been certain of anything beyond the facts she had documented. The Holland covers were gone. The fires in both hearths had been lit since morning. The floor had been polished, and the flowers on the side tables were late autumn chrysanthemums in dark gold and white, which were what the kitchen garden had offered, and which were sufficient. She had spent more than sufficient time, over 18 months, understanding that sufficient was a category she respected. Captain Sir Frederick Holles arrived mid-afternoon with 2 junior officers and the formal military clearance, which was a document of 4 pages in the precise language of official military record, naming battalions, named actions, named testimonies, and labeling Colonel Whitmore's account in unambiguous terms as unsupported and contradicted by the available evidence. Hollies was a solid gray-haired man who shook Edmund's hand with the warmth of a commanding officer who had spent 2 months assuming the worst and was genuinely gratified to have been wrong, and who noted Cecily's arrangement of the room with the brief approving nod of a man who recognizes competence when it has been exercised quietly. 41 members of the county stood in the hall. At the front, near the door to the east drawing room, Alditha stood with Mr. Graham at her elbow and a folded document held with the composed air of a woman who has planned for this room and intends to use it. Miss Carver stood at Alditha's right in pale blue and her mother's pearls, her expression in its most finished form, giving nothing away. Cecily stood near the fireplace. She had her hands folded and her face still, and she was not looking at Edmund, and not looking at Alditha, and not looking at Miss Carver, because she had made her choices, and she understood that the making of them was the whole of what she could do. She had spoken for him. She had gathered the testimony. She had kept this house for 18 months and polished its floors for this afternoon, and ordered the chrysanthemums from the kitchen garden, and believed, with a stubbornness she recognized as the central feature of her character, that the truth was worth the effort of saying it, even when no one was listening. The rest was his. Captain Hollis read the clearance in full, in the steady voice of a man who had read official documents in difficult rooms before, and understood that the room should have to receive the words, not run from them. When it was done, the hall was quiet in the way of rooms that have just heard an unambiguous thing said in an official voice. Edmund received the document and turned to face the assembled county. Alditha moved. She stepped forward with the smooth authority of a woman who had been managing rooms for 30 years and said, "This is a gratifying occasion. We are pleased to welcome Lord Ashvere's honor formally restored. It has been my intention, in the period of his absence, to ensure the estate and his personal circumstances are appropriately managed, and to that end." She held out the folded document to Mr. Graham, who moved to receive it. Edmund crossed the room. Not dramatically. 3 measured strides, the length of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it, carrying him not to his mother and not to the solicitor, but to Cecily, who was standing 6 feet away with her hands folded and her face carefully still, and her eyes holding the quality of a woman who has stopped expecting and is waiting to see what the world intends. He stopped in front of her. He took her right hand in both of his. Her hand was cold from the morning, gloveless, the knuckles reddened from the recent work of arranging a hall full of chrysanthemums without enough household staff. He held it. Then he turned to face the room. "My wife spoke for me," he said. "I will now speak for her." The hall did not breathe. He addressed Mr. Graham directly, without raising his voice. "You may return that document to wherever it was produced, and inform Lady Alditha that her management of this estate is concluded as of this morning." He turned to Captain Hollis. "I would be grateful if you would witness what I am about to say in the same official capacity in which you delivered that clearance." Hollis said, "Aye." Edmund looked at Cecily. He said quietly enough that it was between themselves, though the room had gone so still that more than half of those assembled would later claim they heard it. "I owe you considerably more than this. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making it good." Her hand had gone very still in his. Then she turned it over, deliberate and unhurried, and gripped his fingers. Lady Alditha said something brief and frozen and technically polite, which was the most that could be asked of her in the present moment, and which was, in its way, a kind of dignity. "Mr. Graham folded the document back into his breast pocket with the expression of a solicitor who is glad to have been made unnecessary. Miss Carver's composure held, which was to her credit, and her expression moved through something that might, on a less finished face, have looked almost like relief. She had been told all her life that she was the correct choice, and there was a part of her that had wondered, at moments she would not have permitted anyone to observe, what it would mean to be someone's actual choice, rather than the correct one. She would find out eventually, though that was a different story. Mrs. Potts, standing in the rear of the hall with her hands folded and her face composed, permitted herself the smallest exhale. She had kept this house for 18 months alongside Cecily. She had sat in the library in the evenings and listened to the testimony read aloud in draft and second draft and third. She had kept the kitchen fires going and the hall clock wound and the chrysanthemum beds alive through a difficult winter, and she had done all of it on the understanding that the woman she served was right, and that being right was worth the effort, and that eventually the world would catch up to a truth that had been patiently waiting for it. The ceremony was what it was. The county dispersed by degrees, with the gradual murmuring energy of people who have witnessed something they will be discussing for the next several months. Captain Holez stayed for dinner, which Cecily had arranged 4 days prior, and the table that had seated one person alone for 18 months seated 6 in the warm candlelight. And the conversation was the careful, pleasant conversation of people learning each other's outlines, and nobody was required to speak for anyone who was not present to speak for himself. Later, when the house was quiet and the fires were low and the rooks had long since settled in the old elms, Edmund came to the library. It was not a grand entrance. It was a man coming to the room where his wife was, because it had become, in the short time since his return, the room where he knew she would be. Cecily had her feet tucked under her in the wing chair, and the fire burned soft, and the library was what it had always been, a room that held its occupants without requiring them to perform the fact of being held. She had the journal in her hands. He sat in the other wing chair, which had become his by the gradual logic of 2 people settling into the available space of a room. He held out his hand for the journal. She gave it to him. He opened it to the passage she had named, and he read it in the firelight. And when he had finished, he sat with it for a moment, in the way of a man who has stopped being afraid of a thing and is now simply regarding it. Then he closed the journal and stood and set it on the shelf beside the fireplace, in the gap between 2 volumes of Cowper that had always stood a half-inch too far apart, as though the shelf had been waiting for something precisely that size. "I should have written to you," he said, returning to the chair. "More than I did, and differently." "Yes," she said without reproach. "I should have come home sooner." "Yes. I should have looked at you before I left. Properly. I looked at the circumstances and I did not look at you. And I left. And I told myself that was the practical choice." He looked at her now, in the firelight, in the late hour when there was nothing performing and nothing required of either of them. "You are not what I permitted myself to believe. I know what I am," she said. "I have had 18 months to determine it." "Tell me," he said. She considered him with the directness she had spent a year and a half earning the right to use on her own behalf. Then she said, "I am a woman who knows her own mind and does not require an audience for it. I am persistent in my convictions and occasionally inflexible, which I am told is a defect. I am a competent manager of an estate and a reasonably capable defender of a man's honor in a county assembly. I am not accustomed to being valued for any of it." "You should be," he said. "I notice," she said. that you are issuing that as a declarative sentence rather than a command." He looked at her, and after a moment, something moved in his face that was very quiet, and might, in a more demonstrative man, have been called a smile. "I am still learning," he said, "when a command is the wrong instrument." She looked at him in return, in the low gold light, and what shifted between them in that moment was not dramatic, and did not need to be. It was simply accurate. His attention was accurate, and hers was accurate. And they were two people who had arrived at the same library by different and difficult roads and found it worth arriving at. His hand moved first, reaching across the arm of the chair, the smallest distance. Hers met it without deliberation, because she had been deliberate about enough things for long enough, and this particular movement required none of it. They sat in the old firelit library of Ashvere Hall, while the coals burned low, and outside the snow that had begun falling at dusk whitened the long drive and the stone gate and the frozen kitchen garden that she had kept, through 2 winters, for a man who had not known, until very recently, that keeping was what she was doing. The house had been silent for 18 months. It was not silent now. "Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's year alone in that house moved you at all, leave a word in the comments. It means more than you know." In the spring, Edmund rode out to the south boundary with his steward, and Cecily rode beside him, and the hedge was coming back where the frost had taken it the winter before, and neither of them required it to be anything other than what it was: a morning, an estate, 2 people who had found the word that fit. The journal remained on its shelf between the Cowper volumes. Some mornings she saw him look at it. Some mornings she looked at it herself. Neither of them opened it again. They did not need to. They had read the relevant passage, each in their own season, and the thing it described was no longer the whole truth of him. On a February evening, when the snow came down in earnest, and the drifts were building against the kitchen garden wall, he came to the library to find her at the writing desk with the fire high and 2 cups of tea already poured, and she did not look up from her correspondence when he came in. He sat in the wing chair that was his, and she handed him a cup across the 6 inches of table that separated them, and he took it, and the snow fell, and the house held them, and there was nothing missing.